The rain was relentless that night in northwestern Montana, the kind that soaks through clothes in minutes and turns gravel roads into rivers. Dr. Ethan Miller was used to long days at his small veterinary clinic near Flathead National Forest. He had just finished his last appointment, a golden retriever with a sprained paw, when he shut off the overhead lights and reached for his coat. The wall clock read 9:12 p.m., and the building was already creaking as wind pressed against its siding. Ethan welcomed the quiet. After decades of working with animals, he found his peace in those final minutes of closing, the smell of disinfectant, the faint hum of the refrigerator holding vaccines, the low glow from the emergency exit sign. Tonight would not stay quiet for long. Scratching at the door. At first, Ethan assumed it was branches dragged by the storm, but the rhythm was deliberate, fast, insistent, almost desperate. He flicked on the porch light and pulled the door open. There stood Scout. A shepherd mix he knew well, her fur plastered with rain. What stopped Ethan cold wasn't her condition, but the small creature clinging tightly to her chest fur. A grizzly bear cub, no more than 4 weeks old, trembling eyes half closed from exhaustion. Scout pressed forward without hesitation, pushing past the threshold. The cub refused to release its grip. Tiny claws sunk deep into Scout's wet coat. Ethan felt a shiver down his spine, not from the cold air, but from the sheer impossibility of the sight before him. A domestic dog carrying a wild grizzly cub through the storm. It defied everything he had learned. He grabbed a towel, dropped to his knees, and reached out. Scout stiffened muscles tense as though she might block him. But her eyes pleaded in a way Ethan had seen only in mothers exhausted, desperate to save a life, not her own. This moment carried more than shock. It carried history. Ethan remembered a story his mentor once told him about a dairy cow that lost her calf but began licking and nursing an orphaned lamb brought in by a farmer. That lamb survived against all odds. Cross-fostering happens in the animal world more often than people realize. But to witness it with a grizzly cub here in a storm-battered Montana clinic was something else entirely. He pressed the towel gently to the cub, feeling its shallow breaths. A quick check confirmed hypothermia. Body temperature hovering dangerously low, likely around 93 degrees, when a cub this age should be at least 100 degrees. Heartbeat, faint hydration, poor. Left alone in the forest on a night like this, the cub would have been gone before sunrise. The fact it survived long enough to reach him meant Scout had carried it with extraordinary care. Ethan set the cub on the padded table and reached for the heating pad. Scout whined sharply and leapt beside the table in a single bound, curling her body protectively around the cub before Ethan could intervene. Her entire posture said, "Mine. Don't take her away." Ethan had learned long ago that animals spoke with their bodies louder than humans ever could. He took a breath, softened his tone, and whispered, "Easy, girl. We're on the same side." For viewers, this is the place where the questions begin. Why would a grizzly bear cub, born to a mother known for her fierce protection, end up clinging to a dog? Why would that dog risk her own safety, crossing through miles of forest in a storm just to deliver a wild cub to human hands? It's here, at this point of contradiction, where stories start to grip us. Because what seems impossible in nature often hides the deepest truths about survival and love. As the cub's breathing steadied with warmth, Ethan thought about the bigger picture. In Montana, encounters with grizzlies are part of life. Ranchers worry about livestock. Hikers carry bear spray. Wildlife photographers wait weeks to catch a glimpse of a sow and her cubs crossing a meadow. But in every case, the distance between human life and wild bear life is wide and well-defined. Tonight, that line had vanished. Scout had carried the wilderness into the heart of a town clinic. It reminded Ethan of something simple yet profound. Survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about connection. A 4-week-old grizzly cub cannot survive without warmth, milk, and protection. Scout, grieving her own lost puppies, had all three to give. It wasn't science alone that explained what was happening. It was instinct intertwined with heartbreak, a wounded mother channeling her loss into saving another's young. In nature, caregiving often extends beyond species. We humans tend to put up walls, labeling creatures as predator or prey friend or foe. But animals don't read those labels. They respond to cries, to scent, to the raw pull of life continuing. And sometimes those responses rewrite what we thought we knew about instincts. Ethan adjusted the heat lamp above the table and took notes. The cub female, about 6 pounds, likely orphaned, showed no external injuries. The real challenge would be hydration and stabilizing her core temperature. Scout refused to move, licking the cub's head with slow, steady strokes. Ethan allowed it. In veterinary medicine, sometimes the best treatment comes not from equipment or drugs, but from allowing bonds to work their quiet magic. Imagine losing something precious, something you nurtured from birth, only to have it ripped away. Many of us have felt that kind of loss in different ways. A child leaving home, a parent passing, a beloved pet gone too soon. Now imagine stumbling upon another being in need, weak, voiceless, close to death. Wouldn't part of you, even in grief, reach out? That's what Scout had done. It's not human logic. It's something older, buried deep in the marrow of life itself. Of course, questions still swirled. Where was the cub's mother? Had she been killed by hunters, struck on a highway, trapped in the storm? Would the cub imprint on Scout and lose her wildness? Could Ethan, bound by Montana's wildlife regulations, even keep the cub here overnight without notifying state authorities? Each question carried weight, and each would need answers in the coming days. But for now, in the middle of the storm, one truth held steady. The cub had survived because Scout refused to let go. The clinic was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of rain beating on the tin roof. Scout's breathing slowed as she curled around the cub, eyelids heavy but unwilling to sleep. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching them. He felt a tightening in his throat, the kind that comes when something profound settles into your chest. In his years as a veterinarian, he had witnessed plenty of miracles. Fractured horses walking again, hawks released after wing surgeries, puppies revived after drowning. But he had never seen a dog and a grizzly bear cub choosing each other in this way. It wasn't just rare. It was impossible by every standard of predator-prey relationships. And yet it was happening right in front of him. For the audience, here's the perspective. Shift worth carrying. Sometimes the most remarkable stories aren't about power struggles or survival of the fittest. They're about healing in unexpected places. Animals don't always follow the rules we write in textbooks. They create their own, especially in the spaces where grief and need collide. Ethan knew this story wasn't just beginning for him. Scout's actions had opened a doorway into a mystery that would touch everyone involved. Harper, the small town, and even those who might one day hear about a grizzly cub raised alongside a shepherd dog. He set aside his exhaustion, grabbed his phone, and prepared to call Harper. She needed to know what Scout had done. As he dialed, he looked again at the cub. Its tiny paw rested on Scout's leg claws, barely visible. For the first time that night, Ethan saw a flicker of strength in the cub's half-closed eyes. Not much, but enough to hint at a fight still burning inside. And that's where this story truly begins. A storm in Montana, a grieving dog, a bear cub refusing to let go. From this moment forward, nothing about their lives or ours as witnesses would be the same. But how did Scout, a dog tethered to her human family, end up with a wild grizzly cub in the middle of the night? The answer lay not in the clinic, but in the forest where loss and instinct collided in ways no one could have predicted. When Harper Johnson pulled up to the clinic that stormy night, her headlights cut through sheets of rain. She stepped out of the truck, hair damp from the drive, and rushed inside with a worried look. Scout had been missing for nearly a day, and Harper feared the worst. But what she saw left her silent, her dog lying curled around a grizzly bear cub on the padded table, protective, as if this wild cub had been born of her own body. Harper dropped to her knees beside Scout. "Girl, what have you done?" she whispered, torn between awe and disbelief. Scout wagged her tail once, but her gaze never left the cub. The cub stirred weakly, pressing closer into the dog's chest. Ethan explained what he had seen, the frantic scratching at the door, the cub clinging with claws sunk deep into Scout's fur. the refusal to let go. Harper shook her head. She lost her puppies 2 weeks ago. Coyotes got into the shed before I could stop them. 6 gone in one night. She searched for them for days. I thought she'd never come back from it. The silence that followed carried the weight of grief. Anyone who has lost a pet, or even more a child, understands the hollow emptiness that lingers. Scout had carried that emptiness in every step since the night of the attack. And yet, here she was carrying something else, life itself, trembling and fragile, but alive. For viewers, this is where the unlikely rescue truly unfolds. Because Scout wasn't simply bringing an animal to safety. She was rewriting the instincts we assume are unshakable. A shepherd dog should see a grizzly cub as danger, a threat. Instead, grief had carved a new channel for her maternal drive. Where most would see risk, Scout saw a child in need. This isn't without precedent. Ethologists have documented cases of alloparenting, the adoption of unrelated young across species. A lioness in Kenya once nursed a baby oryx. Dolphins have been seen escorting calves that weren't theirs. Even domestic cats sometimes nurse orphaned puppies. But it's rare, and with predators like bears, nearly unheard of. That's why this night in Montana mattered. It wasn't only about Scout. It was about what happens when instinct collides with heartbreak, producing something greater than survival alone. Ethan leaned against the counter, letting Harper take in the sight. She carried that cub here in the storm. It wasn't luck. It was a choice. Harper's eyes welled. She must have found her crying in the woods. I've heard that sound before, cubs calling for their mothers. You can't ignore it. It rattles something inside you. Cries for help are universal. They bypass barriers of language and species. A baby's cry, whether human or wild, strikes a chord in any being wired for care. For Scout, the cry of the cub was enough to ignite her dormant motherhood, redirecting her grief into action. Think about it. We humans often hesitate when faced with suffering outside our circle. We weigh risks, ask what others will think, and calculate whether we can afford to help. Animals cut straight to the essence. Life is fragile, and if you can hold it, you do. Scout did not debate. She carried the cub through rain and darkness, because to her, the alternative was unbearable. Ethan began preparing a formula designed for wild carnivore neonates. But as he warmed the bottle, Scout shifted, allowing the cub to nurse from her instead. It was astonishing, but medically useful. Her milk glands were still functioning despite losing her own litter. For Ethan, the sight brought relief and concern. Relief because natural nursing would stabilize the cub faster. Concern because cross-species nursing carried risks. Pathogens, malnutrition, and even rejection if Scout's body gave out. We often celebrate acts of compassion without considering the costs. True rescue isn't just about saving life in the moment. It's about sustaining it, protecting against hidden dangers, and planning for tomorrow. Ethan knew the cub's future couldn't rest solely on Scout's grief-born instinct. Human intervention, careful protocols, and eventual partnership with wildlife rehabbers would be essential. Still, for tonight, the unlikely rescue had achieved its first miracle. The cub's temperature began to rise. Her breathing steadied. She unclenched her claws, releasing Scout's fur long enough to nuzzle closer her spotted muzzle, brushing the dog's chest. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe she might live. Harper sat quietly on the floor, hand resting on Scout's back. She couldn't save her own babies, she said softly. But maybe she can save this one. In that moment, she wasn't just talking about her dog. She was talking about herself. Loss had hollowed her too. A husband gone years earlier, children grown and scattered. Caring for Scout had been her anchor. And now, Scout, by saving another life, was returning that anchor in a form no one could have predicted. Healing sometimes requires giving what we've lost. A mother who loses a child may find purpose mentoring others. A man who loses his partner may pour love into community service. Loss doesn't end the need to nurture. It redirects it. And in that redirection lies the possibility of recovery. To deepen the understanding, Ethan offered an example from his career. Years ago, a mare lost her foal but immediately accepted an orphaned colt. The colt thrived and the mare regained her strength. What he learned then returned to him tonight. Nature abhors a void. When one bond breaks, another sometimes forms in its place. Not always, not predictably, but often enough to remind us that resilience isn't linear. It's relational. Scout had filled her void with the weight of a grizzly cub clinging to her chest. And in doing so, she had created a bridge between the domestic and the wild, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ethan checked the cub's hydration status, noting progress. He placed a vitals bar on his chart. Age 4 weeks, weight 6 pounds, temp, now 97. 2 DGF hydration, improving after nursing. For viewers, such details may seem technical, but they matter. They transform a vague miracle into something tangible, measurable, and real. A cub's survival depends on ounces gained, degrees restored, and minutes held against the cold. As the storm raged outside, the unlikely rescue inside the clinic grew steadier. Scout dozed lightly, ears twitching with every sound, ever vigilant. Harper leaned back, exhaustion etched on her face, but with a faint smile, her first in weeks. Ethan finished his notes, setting the bottle aside. Why do some animals and some people rise in the face of loss while others collapse? Science gives partial answers. Hormones, survival instincts, learned behaviors. But stories like this hint at something deeper, something we can't quite measure. Perhaps it's that grief left alone consumes. Grief directed outward into care transforms. The lesson isn't only about animals, it's about us. We too can choose what to do with our emptiness. Scout chose to carry. Harper chose to believe. Ethan chose to act. And because of those choices, a grizzly bear cub named Willow still breathed. By midnight, the clinic had grown calm. Rain softened outside, thunder rolling further away. The cub slept soundly against Scout's side. Harper drifted into half sleep on the floor, her hand still resting on her dog. Ethan dimmed the lights, leaving only the glow of the heat lamp. In the quiet, he felt the story widening beyond this room. It would not remain just an oddity, a dog nursing a bear cub. It would ripple outward, stirring questions about conservation, about the bonds that cross species, about how grief and instinct intertwine. And it would test them all in the days ahead. Because as remarkable as this night was, it was only the beginning. Ethan's suspicions about Scout's behavior had barely taken shape. And what he would discover next, not about the cub, but about Scout herself, would leave everyone in tears. By the time the clock neared 1 in the morning, Dr. T. Ethan Miller had checked Willow's temperature 3 times. Each time, the little grizzly bear cub showed small but steady improvement. Her body was warming, her breathing deepening. For most vets, that would be the end of the night's worries. But Ethan couldn't shake the unease crawling at the back of his mind. Something about Scout's behavior didn't fit. Dogs protect. That's instinct. Dogs even show compassion for small creatures, from kittens to ducklings. But what unsettled Ethan wasn't Scout's protection, it was her intensity. She wouldn't leave the cub's side, not even to drink water. She bristled at the smallest approach, then softened instantly when the cub whimpered. It was as if Scout's every nerve was wired to Willow's fragile body. Ethan had studied maternal hormones for years, seeing how a dog's body responds after birth. Usually, when a litter is lost, milk dries within days. Appetite wanes, a mother withdraws. Scout had indeed withdrawn. Harper had described her ghost-like wandering after the coyotes attacked her pups. Yet now, weeks later, Scout's mammary glands were full, milk flowing strong. Ethan placed a gentle hand against her belly and confirmed what he feared: her body was behaving as though her puppies had never died. That was the first suspicion, but there was more. The way Scout leapt onto the examination table earlier, something she had never dared in past visits, spoke volumes. She had broken training, ignored boundaries, all for the cub. Ethan recognized the change. This wasn't just maternal instinct hanging on. This was an obsession. He scribbled notes in the patient file, recording vitals for Willow and observations of Scout. Cross-species fostering. Lactation maintained. Protective response heightened. But the deeper he wrote, the less scientific it felt. He was documenting not only biology, but grief playing out through fur and milk. He remembered a case from 10 years earlier, a collie named Daisy, who lost her pups in a barn fire. Days later, she broke into the chicken coop and adopted half a dozen chicks. The farmer thought she'd kill them, but instead she brooded them like eggs, lying still for hours to keep them warm. The chicks survived the spring cold, but Daisy wasted away. She had given everything she had left, body and spirit, until her system collapsed. That memory haunted Ethan as he watched Scout. Could she endure this? Could her body handle feeding a grizzly cub whose needs would double then triple in the coming weeks? Would her heart heal through this bond? Or would she wither like Daisy, consumed by a grief redirected but not released for those watching? Here's the explanation that matters. Nature sometimes tricks itself. Hormones don't always shut down after loss. In rare cases, the body clings to a state of readiness, searching for something to nurture. That's why Scout still had milk. Biology had left the door open. Grief walked through it, and Willow filled the space. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at Scout curled around the cub. He couldn't ignore his suspicion. This bond was deeper than chance. It wasn't a dog being kind to a wild animal. It was a mother, desperate to rewrite her story, given one more chance. And yet, that chance carried dangers. Willow would grow fast. A grizzly cub is small for only a blink of time. Within months, she could outpace a domestic dog in strength and play. That quickly turns lethal. Could Scout adjust? Could Harper's family live safely with this wild adoption under their roof? Ethan had to prepare for outcomes no one wanted to imagine. But here's a fresh perspective. Suspicion doesn't always mean doubt. Sometimes it means respect. Ethan's suspicion wasn't born of fear that Scout would harm Willow. It was born of awe that perhaps grief had unlocked something even stronger than instinct. He had seen animals collapse under loss. He had rarely seen one transform it so completely. Suspicion in life often carries a negative weight. We think of mistrust of fear, but suspicion can also be the flicker that tells us to look closer, to recognize that something extraordinary might be unfolding beyond surface appearance. Ethan suspected that Scout was no longer simply a grieving dog. She was becoming a bridge between two species that never should have touched. He watched as Willow whimpered in her sleep. Instantly, Scout shifted, licking the cub's ear, a mother's reflex to soothe. Willow quieted breath, evening. The sight drew Harper from her half-sleep on the floor. "She's acting like nothing ever happened," Harper whispered. "Like those coyotes never took her babies." Ethan shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "She's acting like it all happened, and she won't let it happen again." That sentence held the heart of his suspicion. Scout wasn't replacing her pups. She was redeeming them. Each lick, each protective growl, each drop of milk wasn't denial. It was defiance. Loss had written one ending. Scout was writing another. For anyone who has endured loss, this lesson resonates. You don't heal by pretending pain never occurred. You heal by carrying that pain into acts of protection, by choosing to guard life where once you couldn't. Healing isn't forgetting. It's transforming memory into purpose. Ethan checked his notes again, drawing a line beneath the last entry. Observation protective stance persists even against trusted humans. Recommend monitoring for over-attachment. He paused, tapping the pen. Over-attachment could be dangerous if Willow had to leave for wildlife rehabilitation later. Scout might spiral again, sinking deeper than before. The thought tightened his chest. Still in the quiet of the clinic, he knew there was no reversing what had begun. Scout had chosen, and Willow had responded. That bond would shape everything to come, for better or for worse. Ethan dimmed the light further, giving them darkness to rest. Scout lowered her head beside the cub and sighed deeply, a sound that carried both weariness and contentment. Harper pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the storm broke, revealing faint stars over the Montana ridgeline. For the audience, here is the perspective shift worth carrying into your own life when something feels off. It might be more than danger. It might be a signal that you are witnessing a boundary, breaking a rule, bending an exception, rewriting the book of what's possible. Suspicion is an invitation to look closer, to listen deeper. Sometimes what we find is fear confirmed, but sometimes, as with Scout, what we find is wonder. Ethan knew he couldn't keep this between himself, Harper, and the small circle of those in the clinic tonight. Authorities would need to be called, and rehab centers contacted. The world outside would have to know, but not yet. Not while Willow's life hung on the fragile tether of Scout's milk and warmth. For now, suspicion could stay between them, suspended in the glow of the heat lamp and the quiet rhythm of two broken hearts mending each other. The question remained, how had Scout even found Willow in the first place? A domestic dog roaming the edge of Flathead National Forest doesn't simply stumble onto a grizzly cub by accident. Something had happened in the forest, something that tied Scout's grief to the cub's loss in a way no one yet understood. By sunrise, the storm had passed. The mountains outside Ethan's clinic stood sharp and snow-dusted clouds curling off their peaks. Scout was still curled around Willow, refusing to move, as if letting go even for a moment would undo the night's work. Harper sat nearby, bleary-eyed but unable to look away. Ethan poured himself coffee and stared at the pair. His suspicion had kept him awake, but now a larger question pressed on all of them. How did a domestic dog end up with a grizzly bear cub in the middle of a storm? It was Harper who offered the first thread. 2 weeks ago, she said softly, a neighbor told me she saw a sow and 2 cubs just outside the valley. They were crossing near the logging road at dusk. She said they looked healthy. Harper glanced at Willow now, nursing with surprising strength. This one must be from that family. Ethan nodded. It made sense. A sow with young cubs will range low in spring, searching for roots and grasses, teaching her young to paw at the earth and sniff out insects. But with storms, swollen rivers, and the constant rumble of logging trucks, danger hides in every acre. A cub can be separated easily. One slip in the river, one panicked moment when thunder crashes. Sometimes the mother survives. Sometimes she doesn't. He remembered a case reported years earlier, a black bear cub found wandering alone after a flash flood near Missoula. Wildlife officers discovered the mother's body downstream, swept against a log jam. The cub had survived 3 nights on its own, clinging to brush, until hikers found it. The pattern was cruel but clear. In Montana, storms do not forgive small mistakes. Scout must have been searching the forest edge, still restless from her own loss. She would have heard Willow's cry, thin, high-pitched, unmistakable. Any predator might have answered that cry with hunger. Scout answered it with urgency, carrying the cub through miles of rain until she scratched at the clinic door. Wild mothers rarely abandon their young without cause. If a cub is found alone, the mother is likely dead, severely injured, or delayed, far beyond safe return. In such cases, the cries of the young are both a beacon and a death sentence. Most creatures that hear it will come as predators. But sometimes, as in this case, another mother in grief will come as a savior. Harper wrapped her arms around her knees. Scout didn't just find her. She must have searched. She's been wandering the timberline since the attack. Maybe she was listening for anything she could carry back. The words trembled in Harper's throat. She lost 6. Maybe she couldn't stand to come home empty anymore. When loss hollows us, we begin searching in places we never thought to look. A mother who has buried a child will hear every baby's cry louder. A man who has lost his father feels every old voice echo sharply. We are tuned by grief to notice what we once overlooked. Scout, tuned by loss, had heard Willow where others might have walked past. Ethan considered another possibility. There's a chance, he said carefully, that Willow's mother was killed by a vehicle. The logging road runs close to the valley. Bears cross there often. He had seen it before. Adult grizzlies struck at night, cubs left confused on the shoulder. Tragedies that most people never hear about, except as whispers of problem bears in the papers. Human activity doesn't only threaten animals directly, it reshapes every story around them. A cub's survival depends not just on weather and predators, but on how we build roads, cut forests, and leave waste. Scout may have found Willow, but it was human disruption that likely created the separation. And yet, the unlikely rescue doesn't rest only in tragedy. Ethan recalled another example, a pair of orphaned mountain lion kittens rescued near Helena. Their mother was killed by a car, but local ranchers contacted a sanctuary instead of trying to raise them themselves. The kittens survived, eventually rewilded, and were tracked for years, healthy and independent. That case had taught him that what begins in loss doesn't always end there. With help, wilderness can heal. Back in the clinic, Willow shifted, letting out a cry sharp enough to make Scout tense immediately. Ethan stepped closer, checking her hydration, marking down her vitals, now 98.4 degrees weight, unchanged, but nursing well. He logged the moment on his timeline chart, each detail another thread in a fragile story. Scout never broke her gaze. For viewers, here's the caution worth remembering: if you find a wild animal alone, never assume it has been abandoned. In many cases, the mother is nearby, watching from cover, waiting for you to leave. Intervening too quickly can doom a young one that might have been fine. Only when hours pass, when evidence of death or injury is clear, should professionals be called. Scout had made the choice instinctively, but people must not. Call your state's wildlife hotline. Wait for guidance. Respect that the forest has rhythms we don't always understand. Harper wiped at her eyes. "She's stronger already," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Ethan nodded. "She has a chance now, but this isn't just about survival. This is about balance." Scout filled a void. Willow filled another. The forest took one bond away, and in its cruelty gave back a different one. Nature is not fair, but it is strangely symmetrical. A loss on one side of the forest can create a gain on the other. Scout lost 6. Willow lost 1. They met at the seam where grief overlaps. That seam is where miracles happen. The mystery, however, remained. Did Willow have siblings that night still alive, somewhere deeper in the timber? Did her mother fight until the end? These questions may never be answered. The forest doesn't leave records. It only leaves echoes, paw prints, washed by rain, tufts of fur snagged on branches, a cub's cry swallowed by wind. For Harper, Scout's journey into the storm had rewritten grief as devotion. For Ethan, it raised a challenge. If the forest had delivered Willow into their care, the responsibility didn't end with warmth and milk. It extended to teaching her wildness again, preparing her not for a life of dependence, but for the freedom her mother would have wanted. That was the next chapter, how to transform an unlikely rescue into a lasting survival. It would require enclosures, enrichment protocols, and eventually letting go. But for now, the only truth that mattered was this: Scout had not stumbled on Willow by accident. She had followed grief's compass into the heart of the forest, and there she had found another story worth carrying home. And so the real work began. Saving a life in the storm was one thing. Keeping that life alive, teaching it to grow strong without losing its wild nature, was another challenge entirely. The healing would need more than warmth. It would need structure, patience, and a plan for the days ahead. The first week after the storm passed in quiet rhythms. Ethan opened his clinic every morning to the same sight: Scout curled around Willow on the padded mat, eyes opening as soon as the door creaked. The grizzly bear cub stirred, nuzzled into Scout's fur, and let out small cries until milk soothed her. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was routine practiced with the steadiness of a family. Harper brought blankets from home toys Scout had once used to calm her pups. Scout ignored the toys but dragged the blankets into a nest, arranging them so Willow had a softer place to crawl. Every action told the same story: she was still grieving, but the cub was giving her purpose. Ethan watched closely, torn between admiration and responsibility. He knew bonds like this were precious, but also precarious. That's why he decided to build something more structured. In the barn behind the clinic, he cleared space, lined it with straw, set up heat lamps and a climbing log. He measured out dimensions carefully, making sure there was room for Scout's body and space for Willow to practice movements natural to a cub. He added perches, scent trails, and an old stump filled with insects so Willow could paw and sniff as she would in the wild. It wasn't the forest, but it was a beginning. Enrichment isn't a luxury in wildlife care, it's survival. A cub raised without challenge, without things to climb or scents to follow, loses its wild edge. And a cub that loses its wildness is a cub that can't return to the forest. Ethan's enclosure wasn't about comfort. It was about preparing Willow for independence even while she depended on Scout. 2 orphaned fox kits were raised in a sanctuary. Volunteers fed them, kept them warm, but left them in bare cages. By release stage, the foxes had no skills. They approached humans instead of avoiding them starved when they couldn't scavenge on their own, and both were found dead within months. That memory fueled Ethan's determination. Willow's survival required more than milk. It required practicing. Instinct reawakened through structure. Scout adapted quickly. She guided Willow to the stump, nudged her toward the straw pile, and barked gently when Willow strayed too far. It was uncanny to watch a dog acting not only as mother, but as teacher. Each day, Ethan documented progress on a chart, weight up by ounces, hydration, stable body temperature steady. At the bottom of the page, he noted behavior climbing, pawing at insects, alert to new sounds. The chart became a story of healing in numbers. But the healing wasn't only Willow's. Ethan noticed Scout beginning to eat again. At first, to just a few bites of kibble. Then, after days of coaxing full meals. She drank deeply rested without constant trembling. It was as though nursing Willow restored the will she had lost with her puppies. For Harper, it was bittersweet. "I've been feeding her by hand for weeks," she told Ethan. "Nothing worked. But now she's alive again." Sometimes healing requires a shift of focus. Scout had been trapped in grief, circling the space of her lost litter. By redirecting her care onto Willow, she stepped out of that circle. Humans are no different. A person stuck in mourning often finds strength not by looking inward, but by finding someone else to care for. The act of protecting another life can quietly protect our own. Still, Ethan carried concern. He knew attachment like this could complicate the future. Willow could not remain a pet. State law required that any grizzly cub orphaned in Montana be placed with licensed rehabilitation centers trained for reintroduction. He reached out to a local wildlife rehab specialist who visited the clinic to assess. The expert crouched by the enclosure, speaking softly, then turned to Ethan. "You've bought her time," she said. "Now the question is whether you can prepare her for the wild without losing her wildness." This fresh perspective changed Ethan's focus. Until now, he had thought about Willow surviving the night, the week, the month. But survival wasn't the end. Release had to be the goal. And that meant creating a balance, allowing Scout's mothering to heal them both, while also keeping Willow from imprinting too deeply on domestic life. It was a narrow road, but one worth walking. The days grew longer, spring sliding toward summer. Willow learned to climb the log scramble across straw bales and bat at dangling ropes. Scout watched closely, correcting with nudges and soft barks. Ethan filmed short clips for the rehab team documenting progress, a cub pawing at insects, biting at sticks, wrestling playfully with Scout's tail. For viewers, these details matter, because they show that healing isn't abstract. It's measured in ounces gained in steps climbed in playful growls, where once there were only weak cries. Healing for both dog and cub became visible in the rhythm of daily actions. Harper visited, often sitting quietly on a stool while Scout tended to Willow. Sometimes she brought her daughter along, who whispered through the barrier, eyes wide with wonder. "She looks like a teddy bear," the child said. Harper reminded her gently. "She's not a toy. She belongs to the mountains." Those words became part of the lesson too. Love doesn't always mean keeping close. Sometimes it means preparing to let go. Ethan noticed another shift. Scout's posture, once heavy with grief, now carried alertness. She trotted across the enclosure, ears pricked, tail wagging lightly. She looked at last like herself again. Willow had given her a second chance, but Scout had also given Willow one. There was a mystery in this balance. Why do some bonds heal while others consume? Ethan had seen cases where animals adopted across species only to collapse in stress, unable to sustain the mismatch. But here, against expectation, healing grew stronger with each passing day. Perhaps grief had opened a door that instinct alone could not. Perhaps Scout and Willow had found each other not just by chance, but by necessity, two broken pieces fitting together. For anyone listening, here's the takeaway: when healing seems impossible, consider looking outward. Helping another creature, another person, doesn't erase our wounds, but it shifts our focus from absence to presence, from silence to sound, from loss to possibility. Scout didn't erase her pain, she transformed it into care. That's the kind of healing we can all learn from. By midsummer, Ethan's records told a clear story. Willow weighed nearly 20 pounds. Her coat thickened, her movements grew confident. Scout no longer hovered constantly. Sometimes she let Willow explore before calling her back. Healing had reached a new stage: trust. The dog trusted the cub to wander, and the cub trusted the dog to protect. That trust was fragile, but it was real. Still, Ethan knew the hardest part was ahead. Healing in the enclosure was only the beginning. Preparing Willow for the wild would mean expanding space, limiting human contact, and teaching her to fear what once comforted her. That process would test Scout, Harper, and even Ethan himself. But for now, as he watched Willow climb a log and tumble back into Scout's waiting paws, he allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation. And soon Scout and Willow's small family would expand in unexpected ways, new arrivals that would test the strength of their bond and reveal just how far a mother's heart can stretch. By late summer, Willow had turned from a frail grizzly bear cub into a curious explorer. She climbed logs, pawed at branches, and startled herself with mock growls that made Harper's daughter laugh quietly through the barrier. Scout remained watchful, correcting with nudges, guiding her back when the cub wandered too far. The balance felt steady, yet life in Montana has a way of surprising even the most careful plans. One morning, Harper's truck pulled into the clinic earlier than usual. Her daughter jumped out, hair still tangled from sleep, voice urgent. "Mom, come quick. There's a dog behind the school with puppies." Ethan grabbed his medical bag and followed them through town to a sagging awning near the playground. There, huddled in damp straw, lay a yellow Labrador mix so thin her ribs showed. Around her squirmed 3 tiny pups, no more than 4 weeks old, eyes barely open. The mother dog tried to stand but collapsed back down, shielding her litter with her body. Her tail thumped weakly when Ethan approached, as if torn between trust and fear. He crouched low, whispered, then examined her carefully. Malnourished, dehydrated, but alive. The puppies, though small, showed no injuries. Relief washed over him. "We can help," he told Harper. Together, they lifted the family gently into blankets and drove them to the clinic. For viewers, here's the explanation: stray mothers with young are among the most vulnerable creatures. Nursing drains energy at a rapid pace. Without food or safe shelter, mothers collapse quickly and puppies follow. Intervention at this stage can mean the difference between an entire litter surviving or fading in days. Ethan knew timing mattered. Back at the barn, he set up a separate space with fresh bedding fluids and high-calorie food. The Labrador, soon named Sadie, ate slowly but steadily. Her puppies latched eagerly once her strength returned. Harper's daughter gave them names: Charlie, Rusty, and Max, the smallest. Max's frame was so delicate that he fit into her palm, but the real test came days later when Scout caught the new scents. She stood alert, nose high, ears perked. Willow pressed behind her legs. Willow's curiosity was clear, her golden eyes fixed on the mewing sounds from across the barn. Ethan hesitated. Would Scout see the newcomers as competition? Or would grief-born empathy extend again? He introduced them carefully, setting up a low barrier between the enclosures. Scout bristled at first, body tense, tail rigid. Sadie mirrored her, stepping forward to shield her pups. Both mothers stared, eyes locked. Minutes ticked by. Then something shifted. Max, the runt, wobbled toward the barrier. Willow crept forward, sniffing through the gap. Instead of growling, Scout lowered her head, touched noses with Max, and backed away calmly. Ethan exhaled. A boundary had been crossed, but not broken. Over the next week, short, supervised sessions grew longer. Scout's interest fixed on Max, the smallest pup. She licked his fur when he wriggled close, lay beside him while Sadie ate and curled her body protectively when he cried. Slowly, what began as caution turned into cooperation. Two mother dogs, sharing care across species and litters with a grizzly cub, nestled among them. This is where the story deepened into strangeness. A shepherd mix who had lost her puppies, a grizzly cub orphaned by a storm, starving Labrador with pups all under one roof. Ethan scribbled in his notes. Mixed family, unit forming. Cooperative care, observed. It wasn't just unusual, it was remarkable. For those listening, here's an example worth remembering. In wolf packs, females often assist each other in raising pups, sharing nursing duties and protection. Biologists call it cooperative breeding. In primates, allo parenting is common siblings or aunts carrying young, grooming and guarding. What unfolded in Ethan's barn echoed those wild systems, but across domestic and wild boundaries. Nature had stitched together a patchwork family where none should exist. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it's defined by need. Scout needed to mother. Sadie needed help regaining strength. Willow and Max needed someone bigger to watch over them. Their needs intersected, and from that intersection grew something more stable than any of them could have created alone. Ethan couldn't help but reflect on human lives. Families come apart through loss, divorce, and distance. Yet new bonds form step-parents, adoptive parents, neighbors who become kin. Healing rarely follows the path we expect. It follows the path carved by those willing to stay close when others cannot. Still, he remained cautious. Risk call-outs haunted his notes: potential disease, transmission food aggression, size mismatches. He scheduled deworming vaccines and strict cleaning routines. He built stronger barriers between spaces, allowed contact only under supervision. Healing may come in unexpected ways, but safety had to remain the framework. The fresh perspective here is that boundaries, when managed with care, don't divide. They protect growth. By respecting distance while allowing connection, Ethan created an environment where unlikely bonds could flourish without chaos. It was a delicate balance of allowing nature to act while guiding it with wisdom. Weeks passed. Willow grew bolder, testing her claws on climbing posts, pouncing on insects. Max followed her, imitating every movement, stumbling but determined. Scout watched them both, correcting, guiding. At night, the two young ones nestled against her chest, one wild, one domestic, neither fully hers, yet both claimed. Harper stood one evening at the barn door, watching the scene. "It doesn't make sense," she whispered. "But it's beautiful." Ethan nodded. Nature doesn't always ask permission. Sometimes it just shows us what's possible. When we insist on rigid categories, wild versus domestic, mine versus yours, family versus stranger, we miss the quiet miracles happening in the overlaps. Life is not neat. It is messy, interwoven, stitched together by compassion in unlikely places. Scout and Sadie didn't erase their losses. They built something new from them. Ethan kept recording. His charts grew longer. Willow's weight now 30 pounds. Max catching up to his siblings, Sadie regaining muscle. Behavior notes read like journal entries. Scout licked Max repeatedly after he stumbled. Willow initiated play with Rusty. Sadie tolerated Scout's presence calmly. Healing was no longer a single arc. It was a circle expanding. The mystery lingered, though. How long could this strange family hold? Willow would keep growing, her claws sharper, her instincts stronger. Max would grow too, but never match her power. What would happen when play became dangerous? What would happen when the state demanded Willow's release? Ethan pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the present. Tonight, all he saw was a family forged from absence into abundance. Yet nature moves forward, whether we are ready or not. Willow was growing fast, her wild instincts sharpening. The time was coming when the comfort of Scout's care would no longer be enough. Preparing her for release into the forest would test every bond they had built and challenge the family to discover what letting go truly means. By autumn, Willow no longer looked like the fragile grizzly bear cub Scout had carried through the storm. Her frame-stretched muscles defined, claws sharper, eyes brighter. She had grown from 6 pounds to nearly 60. When she stood on her hind legs against the log in the barn enclosure, her head reached Scout's shoulder. Playful growls echoed in the space, deepening each week, carrying the promise of the wild she would one day return to. Ethan knew that time was coming. Healing under Scout's care had carried Willow this far, but holding her too long would risk something worse than death imprinting on humans, losing her fear, forgetting her wild instincts. Release had to be the end goal. Preparing her for that would test not only Willow, but Scout Sadie, and even Harper's family. The first step was space. Ethan expanded the enclosure, adding climbing poles, boulders, and a small pool fed by a hose. He scattered food fish berries, carcass scraps, so Willow had to forage instead of waiting for a dish. He minimized human contact, entering only with gloves and masks, speaking as little as possible. Each visit he marked progress on the vitals chart, weight, hydration, appetite, and response to new stimuli. For viewers, here's the explanation. Release programs don't measure success only in pounds gained. They measure it in instincts shown. A cub must know how to climb, how to fish, how to avoid people, and how to react with fear to human scent. Without those markers, survival in the wild drops drastically. Ethan wasn't raising a pet. He was preparing a future source of the forest. Scout struggled with the changes at first. She barked when Ethan stopped entering as often. She whined when Willow no longer slept pressed against her belly every night. Yet when Willow batted at fish in the pool or scrambled up rocks alone, Scout seemed to understand. She still hovered, still corrected, but her posture softened like a parent watching a child take first steps toward independence. The rehab center sent an expert, a biologist named Grace, to consult. She observed quietly, noting behaviors, Willow pouncing on insects, responding with caution to sudden noises, and backing away from unfamiliar scents. "She's on the right track," Grace said. "But the hardest part will be teaching her to fear what she's learned to trust." Ethan knew she meant humans. Willow had seen them daily, smelled their presence, heard their voices. That bond had to weaken before release. To help, he installed remote feeders triggered by timers, cameras hidden among the logs, and motion sensor sprinklers near the fence. If Willow approached when humans entered, the sprinklers startled her. It wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning, a necessary fear. Here's an example that highlights why this matters. Years earlier, a black bear cub raised illegally by a family in Idaho became too accustomed to people. When released, it approached hikers, sniffed campsites, and eventually was euthanized after raiding cabins. The lesson: compassion without boundaries can doom an animal meant for freedom. Ethan carried that case in his mind daily. Scout's love had saved Willow, but now boundaries had to prepare her for the forest. For Harper's daughter, this shift was hardest. She had grown attached, whispering through the fence, drawing pictures of Willow with crayons. Ethan explained gently, "If she learns people are safe, she won't survive. The best way to love her is to step back." Tears welled in the child's eyes, but she nodded. That too was preparation for people, not just animals. Letting go is an act of love. Whether it's a child leaving for college, a friend moving across the country, or a cub returning to the forest clinging too tightly can harm. Love doesn't always mean keeping close. Sometimes it means preparing someone to live without you. Ethan found quiet beauty in Scout's adjustments. At night, instead of pressing against Willow, she curled closer to Max, the runt pup she had adopted alongside. Max mimicked Willow's stalking, crouching in play, then toppling with puppy clumsiness. Scout encouraged him, licking his ears, correcting him gently. It was as if her heart had stretched wide enough to carry both a wild cub leaving and a puppy staying. The fresh perspective here is that families expand not only by blood, but by resilience. Scout had created a blended family that shifted with each season. When Willow moved toward the wildness, Max filled the gap, and Sadie strengthened as a mother beside her. Healing wasn't static. It was dynamic, a circle always adjusting. As weeks passed, the release checklist filled. Willow surpassed weight goals. She successfully hunted small prey introduced into the enclosure. She climbed, swam, and hid when startled. Most importantly, she began avoiding people retreating into cover when voices carried. Each marker checked off, each sign of readiness noted. Yet, mystery remained. Would she adapt once free? Would the forest accept her, or would hunger and inexperience bring her back toward human spaces? No one could answer. Release was always a gamble, but keeping her would be worse. Ethan scheduled the day with Grace and the wildlife team. They chose a site deep in Glacier National Park, far from roads and towns, rich in berries and streams. He didn't tell Harper's daughter until the night before. She cried, then hugged Scout tightly, whispering, "Thank you for finding her." The morning of release, Scout paced restlessly as the transport cage was loaded. Willow snarled at first, then quieted, pressing against the bars, eyes fixed on Scout. Ethan lifted the vitals chart one last time, recording weight, 72 pounds, hydration, steady, instincts intact. Then he closed the folder. Heart heavy, but steady. For viewers, here's the takeaway. Preparing for release is not about undoing bonds. It's about honoring them. Scout's love had given Willow strength. Ethan's protocols had given her skills. The forest would now give her freedom. Each step was part of one story written by many hands and paws. But release is not the end. It is a beginning wrapped in uncertainty. What happened when Willow disappeared into the trees would test not only her resilience but the family left behind, and reveal that some bonds stretch far beyond distance, stronger than even the wild itself. The road into Glacier National Park curved beneath towering pines, the truck rattling over gravel. In the back, the transport crate shifted slightly. Willow, once a trembling grizzly bear cub, clinging to Scout in a storm, now paced with restless strength. Her golden eyes glimmered through the slats, catching light, searching for what lay ahead. Scout rode beside Harper, nose pressed to the window tail, still body tense with recognition. She knew something important was about to happen. At the release site, silence hung heavy. Grace, the biologist, motioned to the others. The team moved slowly, setting the crate down near a stream where berry bushes clustered. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Ethan held his chart one last time, flipping through months of notes, weights, temperatures, hydration levels, behaviors. Every page told the story of survival, of healing in unexpected ways. He closed the folder and whispered, "He's ready." The door of the crate opened. Willow hesitated, nose twitching. For a long moment she stayed still, eyes fixed not on the forest but on Scout. Then she stepped forward, paws pressing into earth, claws sinking into soil. She sniffed the air, swung her head ears alert. And then, with a soft sound, a low rumble, almost like a sigh, she turned back. She pressed her head briefly against Scout's shoulder through the bars, an affectionate gesture she had done countless times as a cub. Scout lowered her muzzle, licking Willow once, slow and deliberate, as though sealing a promise. Then Willow moved. Not fast, not frightened, confident. She padded toward the trees, her fur catching sunlight, each step carrying her further from the life she had known. At the forest edge she paused, looked back one last time, eyes gleaming. Then she vanished into shadow. The sound of branches closing behind her was the sound of freedom. For Ethan Harper and her daughter, the silence that followed was heavy but not empty. It was full of months of labor. Sleepless nights, careful feeding boundaries, lessons, love. Scout stood still, ears perked, eyes fixed on the place where Willow had disappeared. She didn't cry. She didn't chase. She simply breathed as though she understood. She had carried her grief into the storm and found purpose in another's need. Now she had let that purpose go. Release is not a failure of attachment. It is the fulfillment of it. In wildlife rehabilitation, success is measured not by how tightly an animal bonds to you, but by how confidently it can leave. Willow's return to the forest wasn't the end of the story. It was proof that healing, when guided carefully, leads back to independence. Ethan remembered other releases, hawks circling high foxes, sprinting through grass owls melting into dusk. Each one carried uncertainty. Some would thrive. Some might not survive winter. But each deserved the chance. Willow deserved it too. Paw prints in mudberry bushes, stripped scat filled with seeds. One night, the camera caught her silhouette at the edge of a clearing, fur shining in moonlight. She paused, looking toward the valley where the clinic stood before melting back into the dark. The evidence was enough. She was alive, she was hunting, she was wild. Back at the barn, Scout had not collapsed into grief as Ethan once feared. Instead, she shifted her focus to Max, the runt she had adopted. Max followed her everywhere, imitating her corrections, crouching low like Willow had taught him. Healing had not ended with Willow's departure. It had expanded. Sadie grew strong, her pups lively, and Scout carried her energy into caring for them all. The family had changed shape, but its heart kept beating. Grief doesn't vanish, it transforms. Scout had lost 6 puppies. Harper had lost years to loneliness. Willow had lost her mother to a storm or a road. Each carried wounds. Yet by caring for one another, they transformed absence into presence, loss into strength, endings into beginnings. That transformation isn't limited to animals. It is available to us too. A woman who loses her partner but begins mentoring young mothers. A man who loses his job but finds purpose, volunteering at a shelter. A grandparent who feels forgotten but discovers connection in community gardens. Healing comes when we take the love that feels wasted and place it where it is needed most. The fresh perspective here is that boundaries between wild and domestic, human and animal, grieving and healed, are not as rigid as we think. The forest and the home, the clinic and the storm, the dog and the bear all overlapped in this story. Life often heals in those overlaps, in the seams where categories blur. If we're willing to stand in those seams, we may find something astonishing waiting. Knowledge matters too. Preparing Willow wasn't guesswork. It required science monitoring weight hydration, caloric intake, teaching fear of humans, and tracking behaviors. It required understanding grizzly biology, their reliance on berry crops, their seasonal movements, and their role in ecosystems. Without knowledge, love alone could have doomed her. Without love, knowledge alone would have felt sterile. It was the union of both that gave Willow a chance. And so the story closes not with despair, but with hope. Scout no longer paced in grief. Harper no longer worried her dog would fade away. Ethan no longer feared his clinic would be a place of only loss. And Willow, wild, strong, free, no longer cried into the storm for a mother who could not return. She had been given a second chance. For you watching here is the reflection. What grief have you carried that might find healing if given away? Who around you cries in ways you've ignored? Neighbors? Animals? Strangers needing kindness? What second chance could you create simply by showing up, listening, or holding on long enough to help Scout didn't set out to be extraordinary? She simply answered a cry. That choice changed everything. And now, a gentle invitation. If this story touched you, if Scout's devotion and Willow's survival reminded you that healing is possible, that family can grow in unlikely places, that even grief can give birth to love, take a moment. Reflect on your own life. Ask yourself where you might transform pain into care. Then, if you'd like to hear more stories of wild animals, of dogs, of bear cubs, and the people who walk beside them, please join this community. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because in the end, healing is not meant to be kept. It is meant to be given again and again until the forest itself echoes with second chances.